I went into Sophie's spare room for a sweater because it was raining and because hers were always the only ones that fit right. The old soft one she kept folded on the top shelf, the way she kept everything neat so it looked like caring instead of control. The door was ajar. The house smelled faintly of the lavender spray she liked to use on the linens. Her laptop sat on the bed, screen bright against the gray of the duvet, as if someone had just stepped away and would be back in a minute. A habit of mine is to check that things are where they should be. It's the leftover of being the younger sibling who relied on lists and schedules to make sense of other people's chaos. So I glanced at the screen because it was there, open to a window I didn't recognize. At first I thought it was another one of Sophie's messy spreadsheets. She kept everything in Excel, in grids that made sense only to her. Rows and columns, color-coded, a tidy kind of hoarding. Then I read the header. Disbursements, 2019 to 2024, it said. Below it, a column of names. Dates down another column. A third column with amounts. Some lines had notes, small phrases like rent, medical, deposit, emergency. The names were not strangers. I recognized a handful before I knew what remembering them meant. An email from Rita, a woman from Sophie's church who had cried in our kitchen last winter. A landlord named Cole, an address that matched the elderly neighbor's mailbox, someone whose first name I shared and whose small son had run through my office last summer. The dates marched in neat order next to them. The amount sat cold and precise. At first my brain tried the reasonable things. Maybe it was a ledger for a charity. Maybe it was Sophie's version of an estate planning tool. Maybe these were reimbursements, loans, temporary transfers. She had always taken charge of other people's paperwork. But the numbers didn't add up the way reimbursements do. Tiny monthly transfers, over and over from accounts with names that made no sense. Lump sums that appeared a week after someone posted a GoFundMe, dates that coincided exactly with paydays. A line for Mrs. Carlson, who'd told me, last October, how Sophie had taken care of the heating bill, read $3,600 on a date 2 days after the family funeral Sophie had organized. Another name, a young man who'd mentioned to me, in passing, a medical debt of $420, had 3 entries, each for the same round number, spread across months. There was a pattern in the penumbra of it, a rhythm like a heartbeat that suddenly didn't belong to a living body. I told myself to breathe. I told myself that reading other people's files was a boundary, Sophie's files, even. But my hands were already moving, the soft wool of the sweater under my fingers, the tag I smoothed before I lifted it to pull on. The laptop was a small rectangle of heat against the quilt. The cursor blinked at the last cell. In the margin, in smaller type, a note, see Maya account. I didn't know why that single word had the effect it did, but it felt like a name singled out on a list of proper nouns. That it was underlined made it worse. Memories skittered forward unbidden. Sophie at my school recitals, effusive and smiling. Sophie on my graduation night, insisting on taking all the photos and making sure everyone had cake. Sophie filling out forms for neighbors, calling landlords, telling stories about people as if they were hers to tell. I'd always felt safe inside that orbit, protected by her certainty. I had a protective reflex that would always put her first. But the spreadsheet looked less like protection and more like extraction. I clicked, not to open the file further but because the action was easier than the silence. A small dialog box popped up, last modified an hour ago, author, s.read. The cursor had been on a cell with a 4-figure number. My heart started to thud, not with the ragged panic of a sudden accident but with a steady, escalating pressure, like the house itself was leaning toward me. I could hear my own breathing in the room, loud and ridiculous. There was no rational excuse that satisfied the small, procedural part of my brain that catalogs risk. The spreadsheet was not an abstract list, it was a ledger of decisions. The notes column used the same phrasing Sophie used when she was being most maternal, handled, taken care of, done. The ledger treated people's crises as transactions. Even the tidy font felt arrogant. I shut the laptop as if I could pretend I hadn't seen anything by making it go dark. The lid clicked against the base with a sound disproportionately loud in the quiet room. For a moment I sat on the edge of her bed with my hands in my lap, sweater half on, listening to the house settle. In the kitchen below, a radio hummed on low. In the street a delivery truck rattled away. None of those noises matched the small, unanswerable thud in my chest. I wanted to put the sweater back and walk out and never say anything. I wanted to close the door and pretend the screen had been a mirage. These were impulses that had kept me small and safe for years: loyalty, fear, the understanding that whatever upheaval hurt most at first would settle if I kept my mouth shut. But there was a different voice, the one that catalogued facts into moral equations, whispering that the sums on the page were not neutral. Numbers could be tracked. Money had a history. People had names on both sides of those columns. My hands felt too loud on the fabric. I could hear the exact moment I chose to look away. I closed the lid, heart thudding. I had no idea then that opening that file would set a chain reaction that could destroy both of us. I spent the next 2 days like someone assembling a map out of torn calendar pages. I worked on Sophie's kitchen table while she was at the clinic, her voice on speakerphone, 3 rooms away, smothered by the wine opener she always used after long shifts. I kept the sweater I'd borrowed folded over the back of a chair so it smelled like me and not like theft. I pulled files from the laptop she left unlocked the morning I found the list of names. I copied screenshots to an old thumb drive I keep for receipts and tax stuff, the one with the cheap tape label and a dent in the corner. I told myself the plan was simple: collect, cross-check, catalog. My hands gave away nothing, my chest did everything else. The files read like the same lie told in many small voices. Invoices, PDFs with clinic letterhead and amounts in the hundreds and low thousands, were dated across 3 years. Next to them were PayPal screenshots, transfers to an email address that used the name Maya, followed by a string of numbers. The notes on the transactions were always urgent: bill help, rent, scan. The amounts matched the invoices. When I traced the PayPal receipts further, the receiving account was registered to an LLC with a shell-sounding name. The company address was a mailbox near the courthouse. I took a photo of the registration page and circled the mailbox number with my finger because putting a red pen on a glowing screen made it feel more real. There were messages, too, texts and Facebook Messenger threads saved as PDFs. A woman named Elisa thanked Maya for covering 2 months of rent while her hours were cut. A man named Jerome sent a trembling voice clip asking for help with his daughter's first dental work. In each case, Sophie, Maya, responded with a plan, a link, a request for $200 or $450 to hold while paperwork was sorted. Later, the same people posted private messages to me in unguarded moments, mad and tired. They'd never received the supposed reimbursements, they'd sent money and heard nothing. Pattern recognition is my stupidly practical anxiety. I created a spreadsheet. Column A, date of invoice. Column B, payee name. Column C, amount. Column D, destination account/email. Column E, supporting doc name. Column F, red flags. I made a column for whether the supposed service, an X-ray, a bail fee, a rent lump sum, had any independent verification. I used conditional formatting like an addict: red for inconsistencies, yellow for things that needed follow-up, green for things that were airtight. The colors made my chest hurt less. The red flags proliferated. Some of the PDFs had weird fonts in the totals. The X-ray clinic letterhead looked slightly off. No watermark, a pixelated logo. The photo of a stamped receipt showed a transaction time 3 minutes after an email that confirmed the money had gone to Maya.help. A scanned doctor's note had an EXIF timestamp indicating it was last modified on the laptop I was copying from. I didn't know how to do forensic deep dives, but I knew enough to notice when file metadata said a photo had been saved on March 14 at 2:03 a.m. but the message to the client said they'd been called at 2:12 a.m. to arrange the pickup. The little lies didn't add up to one big mistake, they added up to a pattern. The trickle of funds was deliberate. Small amounts, repeated. Donors and desperate people transferred $50, $150, $400, figures that felt like help but didn't leave enough to trigger an audit easily. Then there were the larger ones, $1,200, $2,500, each tied to what Sophie called cases. The payments often went into the same ending digits account numbers or into accounts registered to the same LLC. I matched the last 4 digits on banking screenshots to forms signed in scribbly handwriting that apparently belonged to Maya Relief Services. I found a wire transfer to a personal account with Sophie's name as beneficiary when the donor had been told the funds were for a community fund. Every time I found an overlap, a date linking an invoice to a transfer to an account I could trace back to Sophie, I felt my resolve thicken and my throat close. I told myself I needed more proof. I told myself that for everyone's sake I had to be beyond reproach. Notarized copies, balance statements, testimony. I printed things and made 2 folders, one labeled Archive and the other When Needed. The Archive was a neat stack, the kind of thing you hand to a lawyer. The When Needed folder I kept closer, in the inner pocket of my jacket, right over my heartbeat. There were people who could clear this up easily if they were willing. A couple of clients responded when I reached out anonymously. They sent screenshots showing months of pleading texts to Maya, and no refund. One forwarded a PayPal confirmation with a shipping address that was Sophie's old apartment. Another provided a bank statement where a transfer showed up under a manager's name, but the name matched the alias email forwarding address Sophie used. Every corroboration tightened the line between possible and probable. And every corroboration tightened the knot in my chest. Exposing Sophie would be irreversible. She had been our shield after Mom's hospitalization, the one who held us together when bills stacked and Dad muttered that he'd leave it. She'd answered midnight calls, charmed landlords, and organized potluck dinners where she baked a lemon cake with that ridiculous dusting of powdered sugar. She was my protector and my built-in narrative of why our family hadn't collapsed. But there were real people on the other end of the emails who hadn't been protected at all. Their kids missed appointments. Their rent went unpaid because money never reached the intended accounts. Some of them were elderly and trembling with shame when they showed me how they'd been convinced to send funds. The arithmetic was simple. Sophie's narrative of care had been used to extract cash. Whether she'd started this with good intentions or cold calculation mattered less than the outcome. On the second night, after I had printed everything and labeled it again, my phone buzzed. It was a spam text, probably from a number scraped from somewhere. I watched the message like a novice at a crime scene. You're not the only one who knows. My first thought was not fear but a cold acknowledgement. She already knew something could be discovered. She was always 3 moves ahead. I saved the final folder as a PDF, encrypted the file with a password I wouldn't write down, and emailed it to myself because even the thumb drive felt like a confession if it was left in the wrong drawer. Then I shut the laptop and shoved the sweater back over the chair. I stood in the doorway to Sophie's bedroom and listened to the house breathe, Dad asleep downstairs, the faint clink of the kettle in the sink, and understood in a way that made my hands go numb. Once I moved from cataloging to accusing, there would be no retreat. I needed one more thing before I could make that choice, something that would make the pattern incontrovertible. I opened the "when needed" folder and found an empty space where the last file should have been. I knew where to look next. The numbers sat on my phone like something alive. Every time I put it down they crawled back into my head, dates, amounts, little notes Sophie had used to justify the transfers, medical, estate help, Maya fund. I had read them twice on her open laptop, because I had convinced myself the first time my eyes were playing tricks. The second time, the numbers didn't flinch. They had names beside them. They had years beside them. They had the kind of pattern you don't stumble on by accident. Sophie had raised me in a way that people understand without needing to say it. When Mom and Dad burned their marriages into slow, polite silence, Sophie stepped into the breach, casseroles, midnight finals, a soft hand on the back of my head when I cried. She taught me to iron a shirt so the collars looked like a promise. She covered for me when I skipped lectures, texted my professors with an authority that felt like armor. She called herself sister, aunt, savior. In the public version of our lives she was the axis. In private, I was the one who slept on the couch when she worked late, the one who watched her put baby grilled cheese into an orphan child's hands and kiss its forehead with a smile that made neighbors volunteer to babysit. That was why the ledger hurt the way it did. It wasn't plainly villainy. It was a slow, consumer-level theft dressed in succor. Sophie didn't steal credit cards at knife point. She solicited crises, assigned herself authority, and then funneled help into accounts she controlled. She doctored voicemails and photos, the sort of practical theater that looked like proof to anyone who wanted to believe her. She had a knack for extracting consent from people who were already exhausted. The ledger suggested that the consent had a back door, Maya, on PayPal, 3 different bank IDs, and transfers made in amounts just under red flags. It was small enough to be plausible, big enough to be devastating. I replayed her hands in my head, how skillful they had been opening envelopes at holidays, how quick she was to tuck family secrets away into neat, private boxes. The more I tried to shut the thought down, the more the scale tipped, like a child's seesaw that had been rigged. I imagined her with a stranger on the phone, honeyed, sorrowful, taking a transfer for urgent care, while the real urgent care was a transfer to an account she controlled. I pictured the faces of the people whose names were on that spreadsheet, women who had trusted her because she made herself trustworthy. Loyalty is not a single number you can add up on a page. It is a set of habits, of memories and small mercies. Sophie had been my shelter during storms I couldn't name. There were nights when I believed she had saved me from myself. There were times she had closed ranks around Mom and Dad and me with a ferocity that felt like love. To accuse her would be to introduce a rupture into the only constant I had. It would be to let the story everyone believed, Sophie's story, disintegrate into something ugly and true. But complicity was its own kind of weight. If I did nothing, the ledger would keep breathing. New lines would be added, with plausible hardships, and someone else would match the trusting tone that Sophie deployed like a currency. These were not faceless numbers on a screen, they were the money people had set aside to bury a partner, to keep a roof over a child's head, to pay a hospital bill. Allowing it to continue because I loved the person who perpetrated it felt like a moral equation that didn't balance. Silence would not keep my family whole, silence would make me an accessory. I tried to imagine the alternative outcomes, Sophie exposed and furious, the family imploding, mom and dad retreating behind a wall of shame. Rita told me, in a voice that was almost apologetic, that there was a social cost. "Are you sure you can take it?" she asked, and I heard the unspoken part, that once you went public against someone like Sophie, you'd be visible in a way you could not control. Sophie knew how to retaliate. She could fabricate a voicemail, splice together a message, spin a narrative where I was the one who took advantage. She had access to the kind of social currency that makes institutions nervous: donations, volunteers, public praise. She had access to my records. She could make me look like the liar. I made lists. That is what I do when the world wants to tilt, break it down into parts one can move. I wrote the harms on one column and the protections in the other. Harms: continued thefts, ruined lives, the erosion of trust in people who needed it most. Protections: the possibility Sophie would be defended by everyone who loved her, the fear of being alone, the risk of being discredited. I indexed the probability of each outcome against the severity of harm. The math tightened into something ugly and clear. The scale didn't care about my affection. The ledger did not respect good intentions. The hardest calculation wasn't external. It was whether I could live with myself. If I stayed silent, I would sleep with my hands unclean. If I spoke, I would be the person who broke a family. I thought of my parents, how their defense of Sophie had always been reflexive, how their exhaustion made them eager to avoid scandal. It scared me to imagine the way their loyalty could shield something wrong. It scared me more to picture a stranger scraping together funds for a funeral while Sophie called it a Maya fund and moved the money into another account. That night I lay awake and tried to disentangle gratitude from obligation. There were things Sophie taught me that no one else did. There were cold nights where her presence kept me from falling apart. But you cannot honor the person who loved you by letting them hurt others. Loving someone does not create immunity from accountability. In the end I decided the ledger mattered more than the story I had told myself for years. The ledger was people. The ledger was trust weaponized. The ledger was a slow violence that would keep happening if I turned away. I made a plan because plans are the only things I trusted to keep panic from fracturing my decisions. I wrote down the first 3 steps in precise, small hand: copy the files, photograph the transaction receipts, make contact with someone outside the family who could verify. I folded the paper and tucked it into my wallet like a prophylactic. It felt like betrayal and like salvation in the same breath. I was still afraid, of Sophie's voice turning sweet into venom, of what Mom and Dad would say when the air cleared, but that night the equation resolved itself. The ledger had won my moral argument. I would not be a silent accomplice. I locked my apartment door behind me and slid the notebook with the copied files into my coat. The first thing I did in the morning would be to make sure the records couldn't disappear. The second was to find someone who would listen without being related to us. The third was to prepare for the backlash I had already imagined in exacting, awful detail. I stepped outside into the cold and felt the weight of the choice settle against my ribs like a stone. I had no illusions about what would follow. I only knew what I could not continue to bear. The first file transfer started with a click. The list on Sophie's laptop had looked clinical at first: names down a column, dates in another, amounts in neat increments that never quite matched any emergency. I didn't want to assume anything. I wanted proof instead of the gnawing suspicion that had kept my hands raw and my breath too loud at night. So I started as quietly as I could, one person at a time, an innocent check-in that sounded like something a concerned friend would say. I used the contact info next to the names, the clumsy shorthand Sophie had used when she was confident no one would ever pry, an old Gmail address, a number with a burner carrier, a social handle. I told myself I was just making sure people were okay. I told them my sister, Maya, had asked me to follow up because she couldn't reach them. It was a lie in tone only, the questions were the truth. Anna answered on the second ring. She'd been curt at first, defensive, then, when my voice softened, she let the dam give. She called me in tears, Anna said. She'd been at the hospital. Said my rent was going to be evicted unless I sent $500, right away. She said she'd cover it if I wired it to her. I sent it. I mean, I had to. Her voice frayed at the edges. She told me the PayPal handle Sophie had given her and the exact timestamp of the transfer. When I later matched it to the laptop entry, Anna, March 12, $500, my stomach moved like a small animal trying to escape. Priya told me almost the same story in different words. Maya kept me calm. She explained where to get the forms, told me not to tell my sister so she wouldn't panic, she said. She described the way Maya spoke, the slightly theatrical breath, the quick soft laugh that felt like a promise. She sent me a picture of hospital paperwork, Priya said, and then the pause where someone is searching for the right adjective. It looked real. I kept my mouth shut and let her keep talking until she said the word that's keyed all of this in my head before, continued. Priya still sent money in bits, because Sophie told her there were step payments that kept the process moving. Ethan answered from a payphone number listed on a shelter's intake form. He had been homeless and desperate, and Sophie, Maya, had presented herself as both a benefactor and a case manager. She said she'd do outreach for me, he said, voice low with a kind of embarrassed gratitude I recognized from childhood church luncheons where Sophie made sure the right plates went to the right people. She told me not to tell anyone else on the roster. Said they'd mess it up. Said she'd take care of it. He told me how certain she was, and I heard the same cadence I'd seen in the timestamps on the laptop messages. It was almost theatrical, the scripted empathy that preempted questions. I kept a notebook beside me, the pages filling with cross-references. Name, date, amount, platform, story. It started to form a pale map, accounts that received money again and again, the same alias, the same comforting-ized commands to keep things private. Every time I could tie a voice, a time, a transaction to the line on the laptop, my chest hollowed a little more. What made the hollow grow into something sharp was how uniformly Sophie had built the architecture around herself. This wasn't just about siphoning funds. It was about positioning. She didn't merely ask, she intervened. She created crises, or recognized them and widened them, then presented herself as the only person who could fix them. She taught people to stop at her name. She taught them that any attempt to involve someone else would collapse the help they'd been promised. She doctored the scaffolding of belief, a picture, a PDF, a voicemail, and layered it with that practiced tone so even skepticism felt like betrayal. A woman named Teresa told me something I couldn't let go of. She told me this was just between us, Teresa said. That if anyone else knew, they'd force me to take steps I wasn't ready for. She wanted me to feel like choosing her was brave. Teresa's bravery had become a leash. It was also obvious that many of the people I contacted were not just victims of theft, they were still vulnerable to manipulation. A few of them avoided telling family because Sophie had made secrecy its own virtue. A few had been told to postpone applications or to sign over paperwork that Maya would handle. One man I spoke to paused and asked, quietly, if I thought Maya might be able to help with a prescription money transfer next month. He believed in her contingency plans like people believe in weather apps. The pattern tightened. Sophie had been curating testimonials, not deliberately falsifying everything, but inserting herself into enough good outcomes that doubt felt greedy. Where something did go wrong, she had an explanation ready, a cancelled appointment, a delayed insurance payment, a personal crisis, all things plausible enough to freeze a complaint. It was manipulation dressed as maternal competence. When I asked if anyone had ever questioned her or asked to see receipts, a handful laughed a thin, brittle laugh. She'd get offended, one woman said. She'd stop answering. Another described a sudden withdrawal of attention that felt like punishment. That wasn't accidental. It was a technique I knew well from Sophie: reward, withdrawal, and the small, frequent kindnesses that made people excuse the rest. I called 5 names the first day. The dossier on my laptop grew denser. A fund flowed into a handful of accounts and then into one that I'd only seen referenced as Maya account. The dates clustered, the amounts suggested a pattern of staged emergencies. Each corroboration made the laptop's list less like a spreadsheet and more like a ledger of cultivated dependence. Then I noticed a line that ended the way the others did, but with a date 2 weeks ahead. A name I hadn't expected at the bottom, someone who told me, only yesterday, that they still inhaled a little when their phone rang because Maya sometimes called just to see how the plan was going. The date beside their name read like a deadline. My heart went blunt. If she moved on that date, someone I'd spoken to would be pressured again, or worse, cut off mid-process. I folded the paper notes into my palm until my fingers tingled. I couldn't wait to tell anyone in my family. I couldn't even be sure I'd do anything that would help. But I knew, with a cold clarity, that doing nothing would be a different kind of choice. So I kept pulling. And the web tightened. I told myself I would be exact and spare. No amplifying adjectives, no theatrical confessions, just the ledger of what I had found, the way a bank statement reads, date, amount, purpose. I sat at my kitchen table with Sophie's oversized cardigan wrapped around my shoulders and my laptop on a pile of bills so the keys wouldn't creak on the wood and catch anyone's attention. The house was already quiet, Mom and Dad gone to run errands, Sophie's car in the driveway somewhere. I made the burner account first, a throwaway email, a username that meant nothing, because I knew how quickly allegiances calcify into mob logic and I wanted to be able to step back if I fucked this up. I spent an hour editing the post to the kind of plainness I would want if I were on the other end. Facts, dates, links. I redacted last names of clients who had asked me to keep their privacy. I blurred account numbers but left enough digits and timestamps that anyone with a bank statement could verify the pattern. I stripped EXIF data from every photo and renamed files so the metadata wouldn't give anything away. I compiled a single zip, screenshots of PayPal transfers, scanned donation letters signed in Sophie's handwriting, the spreadsheet I'd made with columns labeled date, sender, amount, account, Maya, notes. I labeled documents in a way Tom would understand, chain _ of custody _1.pdf, invoice _2019 redacted.jpg. I wrote a brief cover note to him in the email subject line, urgent, potential serial financial predation, docs attached, and kept the body of the email to 3 sentences. I had found the documents. I couldn't sleep so I was sending them. Please tell me what to do next. The forum post was shorter than I expected. I opened the local, scams warnings, board because that's where people went when they smelled something rotten and I wanted the smell to be public before Sophie could reorient it into a sob story. I wrote, Sophie Reed, also using the alias Maya, has been soliciting money and posing as a caregiver for people in crisis, redirecting funds into accounts she controls. Attached are documents and screenshots showing dates and transfers. I am posting anonymously to protect victims and myself. If you've been asked to send money or sign anything by Maya, please DM me. I will provide redacted copies to journalists and the police. No flourish. No moralizing declared. I linked 3 redacted PDFs and the spreadsheet. Then I hit submit. For a few minutes nothing happened. I waited until my chest slowed enough that I could breathe. Then the notifications began, a screenshot of the post from a neighbor in a private group, a direct message from someone whose name I recognized but whose profile was blank, an angry reply calling me a liar. A few minutes later, the thread had been copied onto a community Facebook page by someone with more followers. Someone else had pasted it into a church WhatsApp with a flurry of question marks. People I had grown up with who had once accepted Sophie's casserole and smile persona were asking for details. Within 2 hours my inbox filled. A woman wrote, I thought she was helping my mother after the hospital. I wired $600. I never got an acknowledgement. Another, I have bank records, how can I help? There was gratitude, which pinched at my ribs, and there was venom, you'd slit your sister's throat online? A private message from a classmate who still attended family gatherings as if the razor were a rumor. It spread not because I had willed it to, but because a thing that favors secrets favors exposure. People are good at gossip and better at forwarding outrage. I watched the post get screenshotted, cropped, and reposted with commentary that made the story larger than the documents I'd attached. Someone added their own accusation that I had missed. Someone else suggested a list of other names to check for transfers. The forum thread threaded into a dozen places I hadn't intended, a neighborhood app, a local blog, a group chat for a volunteer organization Sophie had chaired for years. A church elder I barely knew messaged my mother, is this true? We need to discuss this today. I realized in a small, sharp way that the secret was no longer in my hands. It had been peeled from the living room table and tossed into a river. Part of me felt light, like a weight lifted. I had been carrying other people's losses in my head and in spreadsheets for days. Telling the truth felt like putting them back where they belonged. But another part, the one that had been trained for years to anticipate Sophie's counters, the doctored photo, the staged voicemail, the feigned collapse, was wide awake and racing. I imagined how quickly Sophie could reframe what I had written into a betrayal, the younger sister who had abandoned family for virtue. I knew she had the charisma to invent a counter-narrative that would land softer than spreadsheets. I watched the number of views climb. Someone on the forum asked for proof, Another asked if the poster had contacted police. I forwarded Tom's email. I had hit send before I posted. Habit and fear make you over-prepare. And typed a line I didn't expect to need to justify. I had gone public because time was running out. I asked him to look at the attachments. I asked him to be careful. That word felt like a prayer. As the minutes bled into an hour, my phone wouldn't stay still. A group chat with old friends filled with shocked emojis. Rita sent only one message, a photo of my post and 3 dots, hesitation, solidarity, cost. I scrolled through comments that praised and condemned in the same breath and realized that for every person who messaged me privately to say, thank you, there would be another who would be waiting for a reason to hate me back into silence. I had expected some loss. I hadn't expected how quickly that loss could morph into a thing I could not name. The immediate rupture of community, the reconfiguration of all the small, mundane loyalties into factions. I kept thinking of the spreadsheet rows I'd made, neat, mathematical, finite, and the way an internet post multiplies into rumor and grief. I had unmoored something tied to our living room, and the waves were already hitting banks I hadn't considered. Then, after an hour of watching my anonymized truth unfurl, my phone lit up with a name I had been trying to avoid, Sophie. Her phone didn't ring for 2 hours. I kept it face up on the kitchen counter and checked it like a person waiting for a test result, thumb hovering, eyes skimming for the small red dots that meant someone else was deciding the shape of my day. When it finally went off, it sounded like every room in the house collapsed at once. The first wave was my parents. Mom's texts arrived in quick succession, each more scrambled than the last. Lena, is this true? Call me now. Your sister called us. What did you do? My father liked to avoid conflict, to let storms burn out. His single message said, terser than it should have been, explain. I could picture them in their living room with the TV on for background comfort and their faces pinched, trying to be neutral and finding they couldn't. I called back and listened to breathy, frightened questions through the line. I answered as plainly as I could, but words slid like wet stones and didn't fill the gaps. Then came voicemails. Mr. Cole left the first one, clipped and municipal. Ms. Reed, your post, my office. Some of the tenants saw it. You need to stop this. He sounded like someone who found his routine disrupted by drama and suspected me of being the disruptive element. HR Rep Jenkins left another, more formal. Lena, an anonymous complaint has been filed with my office. We need to set up a meeting. Even through the machine, I could hear the protocol in his voice. A company doesn't like ambiguity, and neither did he. Rita texted, only 4 words, but they felt decisive in their own way. I saw. I'm sorry. No call, and when I dialed back I hit her voicemail. I knew her loyalties had been complicated for years by what Sophie did for us, and the single apologetic text told me she was trying to keep both sides from collapsing her life. It was a small abandonment but not a surprise. The social currency of sticking with the dominant narrative is high, and she had a mortgage, friends in common, a social life to weigh on a scale I couldn't see. Then there was a voicemail that made my stomach hollow. It was someone who used to be one of Sophie's clients, a woman Sophie had apparently helped a year ago. Her voice on the recording was careful and even, which made the accusation stranger and sharper. Ms. Reed, she said, I thought my arrangement with Maya was private. This makes it sound like you made up everything. My family saw it. People are calling me asking if I was exploited. I don't want to be in the middle of this. If you have proof, show it. But if you posted lies, this is cruel. Calm, measured, furious without heat. I rewound that message 3 times, listening for tremors that weren't there. She sounded as if she'd been coached to be apolitical, the kind of voice meant to convince by its normalcy. I thought of Sophie's habit of fabricating evidence, edited emails, doctored screenshots, polite-sounding calls that could be lined up to make a narrative. Panic didn't rush me so much as a cold, precise alarm. Sophie already knew how to make other people's voices turn against me. And then the call. My phone flashed Sophie's name and a picture I'd grown up with, her hair softer then, the smile that had gotten her past neighbor's skepticism. I didn't want to answer, but I did, because the human reflex is still to pick up when family calls. It was FaceTime. I saw Sophie before I heard her. She filled the small screen like she had always filled rooms, posture straight, a cardigan arranged with the practiced ease of someone who never wanted anyone to doubt her competence. Her lips curved into the kind of smile that had soothed people at fundraisers and calmed anxious donors. Her eyes, though, were a different language, very still, the color of calm water, but contained something like a tide. Hello, Lena, she said, and her voice was varnished politeness. I saw what you put up. I kept my voice level. I had to. Someone has to stop this. She tilted her head, small and mothering. You could have come to me. We could have handled it quietly. Her smile thinned in a movement that did not touch her eyes. Instead you chose to make a spectacle. Do you know what that does, to the family? To the people I've helped by keeping things discreet? There it was, the script she'd used 100 times. Keep it about propriety, about harm to reputation, about the necessity of being discreet. In public she could call herself protector. In private she had always used that same language to control. I didn't make this a spectacle, I said. I gave people who were harmed the chance to be heard. Her eyes sharpened. There was a small, almost imperceptible line between them that said she was making a decision. She traced it with her thumb, a domestic motion, a performance of calm. If you don't take that post down, she said, each word deliberate, I will make sure everyone knows what kind of person you are. Vindictive. Unstable. And I'll make sure the people you rely on see that side of you first. She named things she knew would hurt, the office gossip channels, the neighbor groups, the parents at my school district meetups, and she said them with the intimacy of someone who had worked those rooms and kept score. It wasn't a threat like a raised fist, it was worse, a threat that would be carried by other people, by doctored images, by the very network she'd built for years. I won't, I said. Oh, Lena. The faintest of pity creased her forehead, a condescending well-wish. I hope you understand this isn't a cleanup job. This will be a war of attrition. You have to decide if you want to fight it in public or let it erode you quietly. She said that last part like she knew the hours between a reputation and a ruin. Then she smiled, as if closing a book. I'll give you 24 hours to remove it, she said. Consider it a kindness. The video hung on my face for a beat longer. When the call ended, the kitchen felt too large, as if all the walls had been thinned and I was suddenly in the middle of something that would not be contained to our house, our family, or even our names. I sat down hard and the phone was a small, heavy thing in my hand. A war of attrition. I had imagined consequences, arguments, maybe an angry family reunion, but not this methodical, patient kind of cruelty. I thought about the list on Sophie's laptop, the PayPal records I'd copied, the messages stamped with Maya and dates. I thought about the people in those records who might be called to testify against the one who had helped them. Outside, a car rolled by and I realized my locks had been on the wrong setting all morning. My pulse ramped. This wasn't going to be a cleanup. It was going to be long. And Sophie's first move had been to signal that she knew how to start it. The first thing I noticed was how calm she looked in the photos she posted. Not the Sophie I grew up with, the flushed, overly maternal woman who used sweets and soft words to disarm people, but a cultivated calm, the flat, practiced smile of someone who knows exactly how to stage a narrative. She wrote a short paragraph above them, all righteous indignation and wounded sisterhood, accusing me of fabricating my anonymous post for attention and revenge. The paragraph read like a script, betrayal, lies, and me playing the villain for clicks. Under it, 3 images. They were the kind of images people trust without thinking. One showed me in what looked like the back of a community center, a handful of bills in my hand, my head bowed as if in shame. Another had me apparently handing an envelope to a woman whose face was blurred. The caption Sophie added implied I was pocketing cash meant for a crisis fund. The last was a close-up of my hands on a laptop, with a PDF open that bore the logo of the volunteer charity I'd worked with for years, and a highlighted line suggesting a diverted transfer. I knew the mechanics of forgery well enough to see the seams, because for 2 days I'd watched her work from the periphery. The way she doctored texts in old messages and stitched together screenshots that looked plausible until you looked for the small tells, shadow directions that didn't match, the wrong fonts, timestamps that contradicted known events. The first photo's lighting was off, the shadow on my hand falling the wrong way across the bills. The PDF header in the last image had a pixelated logo where the resolution had been smudged to mask cloning. Even so, 1,000 strangers scrolling through their feeds would stop at a single frame and not look closer. Images did what my careful spreadsheets and raw PDFs never could, they made something feel true. The post exploded in hours. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months sent tentative messages alternating between alarm and caution. Some asked if I was okay. One of them, Rita, typed and deleted a message 3 times before sending a short, hesitant "Are you sure?" That read more like fear than curiosity. Others, people I'd considered acquaintances at best, shared Sophie's post with added outrage. The comments section was a small court, and Sophie had brought a gavel. An hour after I closed my laptop and sat in the emptiness of my kitchen, My phone vibrated with an email notification that felt like a physical blow. Subject line, personnel inquiry. From HR. The sender was Jenkins, terse and official. The message was 2 lines plus a link to a form. We have received an anonymous allegation regarding your conduct related to the charity X. Please respond to the attached questionnaire by end of business tomorrow. HR will follow up. There was no warmth, no pretense of procedural neutrality, just a cold pivot from colleague to file. I hit reply and sat with the reply window open, cursor blinking at my inability to produce anything that would erase the smear. I could imagine, too easily, the thin, efficient way an anonymous accuser could trigger laborious, precautionary processes at my workplace, payroll reviews, security log checks, a panel that favored removing risk rather than defending an employee's good name. I called Tom reflexively, the journalist I'd sent the documents to the day I posted. He answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was flat, professional, and had the kind of patience that lives off disbelief and data. I saw the post, he said. I want the originals of anything you have. If anyone's doctored images already, we need the raw files, metadata, dates, everything. They're going to try to make you the story. Don't respond on social. Don't call Sophie. I told him I hadn't been on social when Sophie went public, that the evidence I'd compiled was on a flash drive I'd hidden in a book. I told him about the differences in the shading and the wrong fonts, and he asked the kind of quiet questions that make you feel both seen and exposed. He said, if she's attacking you now, she's trying to control the frame. People believe the person who looks calm. He was right. Within minutes more messages came, colleagues forwarding Sophie's post with "Did you see this?" Notes, the volunteer coordinator at the charity saying they'd received an inquiry, a neighbor asking whether I was okay because someone on Facebook was saying, the smear was not a single action, it was a spread, a pruning of trust. It hit my job, a corner of my social life, and the volunteer work I'd done on weekends, places where my life was practical and thin, not dramatic. Those were the places I had believed were safe. Sophie called that night. I could hear the sound of someone leaning back in a chair, fingers steepled, her voice exacting and small. You shouldn't have done that, she said, the threat in it folded into words so ordinary they felt almost tender. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You're making this worse, I said, uselessly, because saying it felt like a moral plea. I'm making it true, she said. People need to know who you are. It was then that I understood what she had always been able to do, even within the family. She could take the shape of a thing and press it against anyone until their outline matched hers. She had the tools, the doctored images, the networks, an instinct for which doors to open and which to shut, and I had a patience for paperwork and a stack of clean records. Those things did not look the same online. After I hung up, I scrolled through the comments until my eyes stung. A man I'd worked with months ago congratulated Sophie for speaking up. Another acquaintance wrote that if there was even a hint of impropriety, she hoped HR would act. Nobody accused Sophie of fabrication. Nobody asked for the metadata. I sat very still and counted the pieces of my life she'd reached, my inbox, my volunteer references, my reputation at work, my friends. She had not yet touched my front door, my bank account, my phone's backups, but she had learned the map of my vulnerabilities faster than I'd thought possible. Her smile, the same one in every staged photo, felt like a blade. She had started slicing, and the edges were already neat. I opened the flash drive, found the folder labeled Maya files where I'd saved originals and timestamps, and copied them into a new encrypted archive. I messaged Detective Harris and told him, without flourish, that she'd gone public and that an HR inquiry had landed on my desk. Then I sat back and tried to breathe. There was a knock at my door a little after midnight. I told myself it was the mail, or the landlord checking on the building's heat. I walked to the peephole and saw only the hallway light and my own reflection. The door stayed closed, but someone had rehearsed their first strike and had sent it in just enough places to make me stagger. I realized I had set something in motion I could not fully control, and that if I waited to be cleared, the clearing itself might take everything I had left. I hit reply to Jenkins's email and wrote the truth, as plainly as I could, and then I turned the computer off and sat with the dark screen between me and the rest of the world. The next morning would bring calls and possibly the HR investigator's list of questions. The next morning would be the test of whether facts could survive the first public cut. And when my phone lit up again, the words on the screen were not a comfort. The call started before my coffee cooled. Mom first, her voice small and quick, as if she'd rehearsed the words and kept tripping over them. Why would you do this to Sophie, Lena? Why would you hurt your sister? I told her, as calmly as I could, about bank statements, about PayPal confirmations, about the fake invoices and the emailed promises to people who never saw a penny. I told her about the list I'd found on Sophie's laptop, about the alias Maya and the accounts that never matched any charity she claimed to be running. I listed dates and amounts like an inventory of things I wanted to keep factual between us. But her reply was a simple, wounded repeat, "You're accusing your sister." Dad called next. His voice was a practiced low reserve. He'd always been the one to step around conflict. "If there's any mistake, Lena, you can fix this quietly," he said. "Why do it so publicly? Fix it quietly." The phrase, from the people who had let Sophie slide for years, was an indictment as sharp as any courtroom accusation. I wanted to tell them that fixing this quietly was how Sophie had gotten so good at fixing things. She engineered crises, collected money, and rewrote the story if anyone asked questions. I wanted them to imagine the faces of the people who needed the money Sophie took. Instead I said, I couldn't stay quiet. Rita called after them, and I had to swallow. For 15 years she'd been the person who read my drafts, who mailed me casseroles when I was too tired to boil water, who defended me in church basements and in bar arguments. She answered on the first ring. I'd braced for her to sound indignant, fierce in my defense. Instead there was a half-second of a sound I recognized as hesitation, a small, private calculation that she let me hear. "Lena," she said, "I want to believe you." But, she stopped. She told me there were screenshots going around a group chat, that people were saying she'd heard things about me, that she didn't want to be wrong in front of our friends. Her voice had that soft edge you get when someone is trying not to choose. I felt something close to physical pain at that pause. Not because she doubted me, exactly, but because I understood the cost now, not just to me, but to her. I understood that my messy explanation of ledgers and doctored emails sounded, to many people, like a personal spat dressed up as heroism. I tried to explain the voicemails, the cropped screenshots, the way Sophie had a habit of preempting scrutiny by manufacturing evidence, how she'd always been 2 steps ahead. Rita listened. She said she'd think about what she could say publicly, then said she had to go. The line clicked, the silence left the apartment louder than it had been before. By noon someone had posted an edited voicemail of mine. It showed up first on a local message board as a short clip with a caption so sharp it hurt to read, "Lena Reed admits to trying to destroy family finances." The audio was my voice, yes, but not the whole of me. It had been cut and stitched so that pauses became threats, so my inflection on one sentence was spliced next to a different clause to imply intent I did not have. I could hear my own laugh in it, rearranged into a sneer. Whoever had done it knew exactly which syllables to pull to make me look monstrous. Messages flooded after that, not the careful, inquisitive texts from reporters asking for comment, but raw, ugly things. Screenshots of my apartment building with a red circle, usernames I didn't know claiming to have traced my finances, threats that alternated between legal warning and personal menace. One message was a photo taken from across the street at dusk. My kitchen window was just a dark rectangle but the caption read, "We know where you sleep." Another was a string of expletives and a line I'd seen in the comments of other threads, "You took from people. You'll pay." I kept thinking of how Sophie had taught herself to carve narratives out of other people's trust. This was the same skill set with a different aim, not convincing donors to send money, but convincing everyone I knew that I was the liar, the traitor, the difficult child who needed to be quieted. She wasn't just fighting me online. She was trying to remove any foundation of trust one had left. If my neighbors, my friends, my parents started to believe the stitched audio and the angry screenshots, the rest of my work, the police report, the stacks of invoices I'd compiled, the victims I'd found, would be dismissed as a vendetta. A notification popped up from my workplace. HR had received an anonymous complaint that I'd been coercing people into making false statements about my sister. The tone in the email from Jenkins, professional and thinly alarmed, made it clear how paper-thin reputations are. The same week I tried to do the right thing, I now had a formal inquiry into my conduct and emails from people who wanted distance. I tried to breathe through it. I filed screenshots, forwarded links to Tom, and watched as he texted back that he'd started a timeline and was saving everything. Detective Harris called me in the afternoon, patient and methodical, asking for copies of the originals, not the manipulated posts. I emailed him what I had, but every forwarded document felt like a thimble of water against an ocean of noise. At night, when the calls stopped and the messages continued, anonymous, relentless pings that woke me at 2 and 3 in the morning, I sat in the dark and counted the ways Sophie could make silence look like confession. I thought about every time she'd smoothed over a conversation at family dinners, Every time she'd redirected a question to protect herself. The skill that had made her a natural caregiver had been the same skill that let her fabricate consent. I unlocked my phone to another message, a single image, a close-up of the front door to my building, the peephole circled in red. No words. My left hand went cold. I stared until the light from the screen blurred. Then I opened my contacts and pressed Harris's name. I carried the folder like contraband. It was heavier than I expected, not because of the printouts, but because of what they meant. Inside were PayPal screenshots with transaction IDs and timestamps, bank transfer records with routing numbers, the original image files from Sophie's laptop exported with their EXIF data intact, raw message headers from the email chain, the salted logs from the donation page, and a thumb drive with everything in its original folders. I had printed a chronology and stapled the victim statements I'd recorded, not the edited clips Sophie could twist, but full-length recordings where people told, in their own stilted voices, how Maya had appeared during a crisis and asked for money that never fixed anything. I sat in a lobby that smelled like coffee and detergent and waited until an officer with a tired name badge signaled me over. He listened politely, the kind of polite that has schedules and quotas behind it. He took one quick look at the folder, flipped through a few pages, and told me to write a statement. I did. I filled in the facts exactly as they had happened, careful to separate what I knew from what I feared. When I finished, he handed the folder back with a stamp and a sentence meant to reassure, "We'll look into it." It felt the way someone feels when they hand you a map and a flashlight and say the woods are big. Detective Harris was not the man who handed me the map. He was the one who stayed when I brought the folder back 2 hours later because the packages had started arriving. 2 brown envelopes were on my doormat that morning, no return address, my name written in ink like a tired signature. One contained a daisy pressed between wax paper, the other was a photo of my apartment building taken from the street, the angle unmistakable. Whoever sent them wanted to remind me that they could find me. "You did the right thing coming in," Harris said when he opened the folder. He set his cigarette pack aside and began methodically, dates, times, screenshots, originals. He asked about chain of custody, and when I said I had the raw files exported with metadata and the logs from the donor portal I'd saved as a CSV, he nodded. His fingers moved across my papers as if they were physical clues rather than accusations. For the first time since I'd closed Sophie's laptop, someone looked at me like what I was saying might actually be true. "I need everything you have," he said. "We'll request subpoenas for the accounts, get bank cooperation, but proving intent is its own animal." He didn't try to soften it into comforting words. "This is going to be slow and ugly. She can layer doctored images and call things gifts. We can prove transfers, but proving you were targeted for exploitation, that's going to take corroboration, patterns, witnesses. You've brought that, but you have to be prepared." I told him about the recordings, victims who had said the same things in different ways, the voice messages where Sophie, as Maya, coaxed passwords or pressured for quick transfers. I handed over the full files. I'd made sure no one had compressed or edited them. Harris logged their accession numbers like a librarian marking rare books. He asked if I'd notified anyone else. Tom's name came out before I could second-guess it. Tom had been careful. When I'd emailed him the initial dump, he'd replied within the hour asking for a timeline and whether I could substantiate the transactions with bank statements and interviews. By the time I walked into the precinct, he'd already been in touch with 2 of the women in my folder, not to sensationalize, but to ask exacting questions about dates and amounts and the phrasing Sophie used. He walked in behind me with a small recorder and a notebook and the kind of face that made it clear he had shifted from curiosity to ledger. "You sure you want to do this without going public?" he asked quietly. He already had the corroborating statements on his phone and the notes to back them up. He could run a story that night and force an audit. He also knew, as well as Harris did, what Sophie could do: a counterpost, a sympathetic video, a doctored voicemail. We were trying to build a spine of evidence sturdy enough to withstand the first push. Harris said the same thing in a different way. "You want seizure warrants. You want audit trails from the payment processors. You want a judge to see the pattern before a smear campaign gets a foothold. You also need a protective order if packages are showing up. Can I get you one today?" The paperwork for the temporary restraining order felt bureaucratic and absolute. I signed on the dotted line stating that I had reasonable fear for my safety and detailed the incidents, the envelopes, the photos, the repeated attempts to contact my employer through anonymous tips. The officer typed my affidavit into the computer and said, "We'll get you an emergency ex parte. But it's only a piece of paper unless we can show a continuum." He meant the network of transfers, the witnesses who would testify to the pattern, the audit that would make the money trail public. When I asked Harris whether there was a risk to bringing Tom into the room, to having an impartial journalist now become a named contact in an investigation, he shrugged. You pick the risks you can manage. Media pressure can move agencies that are slow to act. It also makes her angry. We'll lock down what we can. Change passwords, get a new router, don't open anything from unknown senders. If she's smart, she'll try to manufacture a counter-narrative. Preserve originals. Do not engage. We sat in a small interview room while Harris called the judge's clerk. Tom left, promising to hold his position on publication until law enforcement had their paperwork. It felt like asking someone to wait through a storm. Upstairs, I watched the door. Every creak was Sophie. Every car outside was someone watching. He handed me a cover sheet to certify receipt of all materials. It read like a ledger, a list of disclosures that could be sent to the banks, to the prosecutor, to a judge. The officer stamped it. The stamp made it official in the way my signature alone could not. On the way out, Harris added one more thing, not a procedural requirement but a quiet human instruction. People like her speak in stories that sound clean. We break the stories into little crimes. We take them one at a time. It will be slow. It will be ugly. But it's how you win. I believed him the way you believe a doctor when they tell you the treatment will hurt. As I stepped into the cold, the first envelope was still on my doormat. The second arrived that night. Inside, a Polaroid of my keys on my kitchen counter and a single sentence written on a scrap of paper, "We will win." When the judge signed the temporary order the next morning, Harris put it in an evidence envelope and looked at me like he was handing me something fragile and dangerous all at once. "This is a start," he said. I folded it into my pocket and felt the weight of what that start required. The first sign wasn't a scream or a broken window. It was a little plastic beep from my wallet at the coffee shop when my card was declined. I dug the thing out like you do when you're embarrassed, apologizing to the cashier, fumbling my phone, and opened the bank app. A withdrawal for $1,200 at an town, time-stamped 2 hours earlier. The balance read like a wound. I called the fraud line with one hand still sticky from the espresso machine steam. They put me on hold long enough to feel my pulse in my throat. When someone finally came on, they said they could freeze the account, issue a new card, and open an investigation, but the money was gone. Cash withdrawal, the agent said. No merchant attached. He gave me a reference number and the tone of corporate regret. I wrote the number down in a little spiral notebook the way I had been taught to write down everything. That afternoon Jenkins from HR called. He sounded carefully neutral, like someone expecting to be attacked in a deposition. "Lena, we received a formal complaint about an incident in the break room in May," he said. "There are allegations of physical aggression. Under policy, we have to place you on paid administrative leave while we investigate." My voice went small. "I didn't. I know you say that," he interrupted, "which is what people do when they have a script to follow. We'll conduct interviews. We suggest you gather any documents or witnesses." The complaint had a header that could have come from a handbook template, complainant name redacted, supporting evidence attached. I asked for the attachments. Jenkins forwarded a single audio file. It was my voice, but so clipped and edited that the sentence began in the middle of another word and stopped as if someone had cut tape. They had spliced my defense into something sinister and hung it for show. I felt a dry, clear panic, the sort that shuts down your rational brain into a hub of urgent lists. Call Detective Harris. Save every copy, back up my laptop, call Tom. I told Mr. Cole, my landlord, the same thing in a voice that tried to sound like a woman who could keep her roof over her head. "There's been an email, Lena," he said. He was older, and I could hear his discomfort like a pulsating thing through the line. "A complaint about domestic violence connected to your unit. I don't know what to do, but I have to consider the building safety." The email had photos attached, blurry, staged, the kind of images you take of the right angle to imply a bruise that wasn't yours, taken at a different time. The sender used a throwaway address and called themselves concerned. I could hear the way Mr. Cole was trying to be fair, which in practice meant leaning toward caution until he had no choice. "We'll wait for police," he said. He didn't say that he had the option to non-renew my lease, but it was clear. That was the arc Sophie wanted: isolate, remove resources, undermine credibility. Cut the wires of contact so people she had already convinced would reconsider. Leave me alone and small with a portfolio of accusations she had cultivated. I called Harris. He listened. He asked what I had and reminded me to preserve everything. "These people are good," he said once, the voice of a man who had seen the same pattern enough to recognize the choreography. "They fabricate. They coordinate. Don't engage, document. We'll open a file." So I documented. I printed bank records until my printer ran out of ink. I labeled each transcript with dates and source IDs. I copied the audio file onto an external drive and wrote the file hash on a post-it. I texted Tom the link. I sent Rita a short message, "I need you to tell them you heard me that day, if they call." Her reply came back, "I'm scared, Lena." I know. Do you know how bad this will be? That night I didn't sleep. I slept in a shirt and jeans, shoes near the door, because that part of my brain that had always been practical refused to surrender to adrenaline. At 4 a.m. I woke to a sound like a fingernail on wood. I lay still and listened. 1, 2, 3, then the familiar metal scrape of a lock being forced, clumsy and hurried. I turned on the lamp and crossed the apartment in long, quiet strides. The deadbolt would normally click with a soft, certain noise. The bolt sat half out, the circle of the strike plate scratched. Someone had twisted the cylinder with a tool. There were smudges on the frame where leather had rubbed, small indistinct prints. Tucked into the doorframe, folded once, was a slip of paper. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The paper smelled faintly of coffee and something floral, Sophie's perfume, and I knew immediately that the scent was not a coincidence. People are careless with the things that prove them right. 3 words were written in an even, unhurried hand: "We will win." My throat closed. I could feel my pulse in every knuckle. I took a picture with my phone despite the shaking. I ran a thumb along the ink. It did not smear. Whoever had left it wanted me to find it. The note wasn't a promise for tomorrow. It was a verdict delivered in the middle of the night. I pocketed the paper and called Harris. He said he'd be there in 20. As I waited, I sat on the floor with my back to the door and tried to catalog what could be used against me next: bank records, employment, a fabricated assault, a landlord with a file. The list was mechanized and terrible. Each new entry tightened Sophie's web. Out on the street a car engine idled and then pulled away, tires whispering on wet pavement. In the ring of the porch light I could make out the shadow of a figure stepping into the street, brief, deliberate. It felt like a confirmation, and it felt like a threat. When Detective Harris arrived he moved through the apartment like a man putting pins in a map. He photographed the lock, bagged the note, asked the practical questions that felt like lifelines. "We'll get the camera footage from the nearby intersection," he said. "We'll subpoena transaction records." I wanted to rip the phone out of my hand and start yelling, but the list of do nots from Harris was imprinted in me now. "Don't go to social media, don't answer provocation, don't meet alone." He said, "They escalate when they smell victory." The sentence was simple. The thing it meant was not. The note sat like a seed in my pocket: "We will win." I had been trying to calculate loss, what could be taken and what I could still hold, until that scrap reframed it. This wasn't about winning money or silence. It was about making me small enough to surrender before the audit ever began. Outside, the streetlight hummed. Inside, my hands folded the paper into evidence bag number 4 and labeled it. My phone buzzed with an incoming call labeled unknown. I stared at it, the way you stare at a wound you can't ignore, and realized there was another line in Sophie's playbook I hadn't yet anticipated. I hit ignore. The recording started. A deep voice, muffled by a laugh, said hello, then a single sentence that felt like a curtain drawing closed: "You took everything from me, enjoy the ruins." The hearing room smelled like copier toner and old carpet. Fluorescent lights buzzed in a rhythm that made my pulse feel slow and loud. They called sides, they swore witnesses. The clerk's voice was flat and procedural enough to make everything real. I sat under those lights clutching my printed evidence like a rosary: bank statements, PayPal screenshots, the emailed excuses Sophie had sent and then edited, phone logs with timestamps that matched the dates on the names list I'd found on her laptop. The pages creaked when I shifted. I kept my thumb on the margin where I'd penciled notes so I wouldn't lose my place. Sophie sat across from me, immaculate in a dark coat she never removed. She smoothed her sleeve with the kind of small, practiced motion I'd seen 1,000 times, the same motion that made neighbors trust her when she brought casseroles or organized fundraisers. Her lipstick was neutral. Her smile was gentle when the judge spoke. She told her version calmly: me as a jealous, vengeful sibling with a grudge, me wanting attention, me inventing victims to punish her. The words were precise and rehearsed. She framed it as a family quarrel. When she looked at me, there was pity, like my anger was childish. My throat tightened. All the nights I'd lain awake imagining how she would prepare her defense, doctored voicemails, altered photos, a sympathetic narrative, came back to me. I remembered the tampered lock on my apartment, the anonymous tip to HR, the voicemail she'd posted with my voice edited to sound accusing. Everything about her skill at manufacture was in play. If the room believed her, any audit would be spun into vindictive bureaucracy. If they believed me, there might be an actual accounting. Then they called the witness I'd been afraid to name, a client I'd interviewed in the quiet after midnight calls, a small business owner who had sent money when Sophie, under the name Maya, told her the bills would save a flat that otherwise would be lost. She was smaller in person than her online persona suggested, hands folded tightly, voice thin with exhaustion. She said, under oath, the exact thing my documents showed, the date, the amount, the routing number that matched the PayPal screenshot I'd highlighted in yellow. June 12th, she said. 1,200. To Maya. For rent assistance. She said the words slowly, like each syllable was a stone she didn't want to drop. The judge leaned forward and asked her to clarify the name on the transaction and whether she had an independent record of it. The woman pulled a printed bank statement, her copy, and pointed to the line. Her fingers trembled. The clerk marked it as an exhibit. The number on her statement matched my screenshot down to the cent. The date lined up with the text thread where Sophie, as Maya, had told her to expect the transfer. The witness's testimony matched my pages so precisely that the room took a small collective breath. I felt it in my ribs. For the first time since I found Sophie's open laptop, something like relief eased the tension in my shoulders. Not because I wanted Sophie punished, though I did, but because I had feared being alone in the truth. The witness's voice braided with my printed evidence and made a strand I could hold. Detective Harris, who'd sat mostly silent until then, gave the briefest of nods. Tom Alvarez was in the back row, jaw set, papers in his lap but eyes on the judge. My parents were in the gallery, their hands were knotted together, faces drained. I saw Margot blink once and look away, the way someone looks at a neighbor's house in a storm. Sophie's lawyer tried to undercut the testimony, questions about memory, about whether the witness had been coached. Sophie smiled when her lawyer suggested I had motive. She spoke softly, the words that had worked a dozen times before. Lena has always been competitive, she said, as if I were a schoolyard rival and not a woman whose life Sophie had shadowed for decades. Then the judge did something that would change everything. He asked the clerk to produce a copy of the exhibits and, to my surprise and mounting hope, said, given the specificity of the alleged transfers and the number of complainants, I am ordering a forensic audit of the accounts associated with the alias Maya and any account controlled by Sophie Reed. The audit will be conducted by the county auditor and completed within 30 days. The words landed like a gavel dropped twice. The room hummed quieter for a moment. Papers rustled, someone muttered. My hands went cold. The printed packets I'd brought felt heavier, like they had mass beyond water and ink. Sophie's smile thinned. It sharpened from polished charm into something animal and immediate. For a heartbeat it wasn't anger or calculation. It was fear, pure, visceral fear that pulled at the edges of her composure and showed too much skin. Her nostrils flared. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes, which had been so carefully warm, went hard and small, alert the way a hunted thing's eyes go. She looked like a person who'd been trained to prey but had never anticipated being challenged by someone who refused to look away. I had thought I knew the range of what she would do, social ruination, lies, forged messages, but the look on her face expanded that range into something I couldn't fully name, a willingness to do anything to keep the ledger closed. To stop counting. To erase testimony. To make sure the audit never reached the line items that would show where the money actually went. The judge continued, procedural and unaware of the small, human warp the order had produced across the table. Sophie's lawyer objected to scope. The judge set terms and dates. In the pew behind me, a woman sniffed, quietly. I pressed my thumb into the margin of my notes until the ink left a smudge. When the hearing adjourned, people rose and shuffled out in polite clusters. Sophie gathered her coat with the same careful motion and left last, eyes briefly on me like a promise. I walked out into a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and old light fixtures and felt, embarrassingly, like I was the one under threat. My phone buzzed with a text I didn't want to open. My apartment key rattled in my hand as I thought of the tampered lock, the anonymous tips, the packages on my stoop. The audit would take time. The audit would force numbers into daylight. She would do anything to stop the audit from finishing. The audit came back like a verdict and a wound. Numbers in neat columns, stamps and signatures, transfers flagged in red that ran for years like a slow hemorrhage. The auditors traced account after account into the same places Sophie had access to. They matched timestamps with the emails I'd pulled, with the PayPal screenshots the women had sent me in private messages. There were memos in an account under Maya that referenced crises that never happened, invoices with the wrong letterhead, voicemails Sophie had forged and then saved to make them sound real. Detective Harris sat beside me in the conference room while the auditor said the words I'd rehearsed until they tasted metallic: unauthorized transfers, misappropriation, conspiracy to defraud. Sophie was arrested that afternoon. When the handcuffs clicked, I felt a thin, steady relief, like a string pulled taut and finally cut. It didn't sing. It vibrated. I went home and watched my kettle boil until the water evaporated and the metal stank. The victory was hammered and raw. It existed on paper and in a courthouse hallway where a bailiff's boot scuffed up the floor tiles. It did not exist in the space where Sophie had been my sister. The first cost was in the quiet. My parents stopped calling. At first I told myself they were processing, that they needed time. I drove to their house 2 weeks after the arrest because I couldn't stand the silence on my end of the line. The porch light was on, but the car in the driveway belonged to Mr. Cole, the landlord. He'd come by for a repair. My mother opened the door and looked through me. Her mouth moved but nothing came out. My father watched from the kitchen like a man waiting for a storm to pass. They had spent a lifetime defending Sophie in small, exhausted ways, changing the subject, minimizing the complaints, saying she was trying to help. Now those old muscles flexed for her again. "We need space," my mother said and closed the door. I stood on the steps until the cold cut through my jeans, and the only sound was the distant hum of a lawn mower. Old friends dissolve the way a scar fades when you pick at it. Rita texted once, a single sentence: "I won't come between you two." Then nothing. People I thought we had in common with, neighbors, church acquaintances, the women who had once baked pies for Sophie's support groups, turned their faces. Social media became a field of rumor and accusation where a single doctored photo Sophie had posted the week before hung like evidence against me. Tom called to say the paper would run the story with the audit attached. He sounded relieved and tired. "You'll get hate," he warned. He was right. Anonymous messages suggested my career was over. HR Rep Jenkins cleared my file in the end, but walking into the office after the probe felt like entering a room that had memorized me and then decided it didn't like the script. People whispered in the break room. The IT guy's eyes lingered on my badge a beat too long. Being legally vindicated did nothing to repair the looks that checked for sympathy and found none. The victims came to court with their hands folded, with tissues, with files I had not dared to look at for fear of collapsing. Some of them cried when the auditor spoke. Some hugged me so hard I thought their ribs might crack. Their relief was not a chandelier of gratitude falling into my lap. It was steadier, a collection of quiet thanks threaded through fatigue. Justice, when it slid into place, had jagged edges. None of the women could undo what Sophie had done to their trust. None of the money pulled back could fix how one of them had been evicted the month after she paid a fictitious emergency fund. Sophie attempted 1,000 small counterattacks from the visiting room of the jail. She wrote letters and had friends pass along copies of doctored voicemails showing me as paranoid and unhinged. She filed a complaint about me with HR the morning after her arrest, a spiteful, precise thing that alleged I had forged documents and misused company time. The complaint went nowhere, but it cost days and headaches and another round of whispers. Then the packages started: a box of broken glass left at my doorstep, a child's shoe, an old photograph ripped in half. Detective Harris called every time and went through the motions: evidence bag, catalog number, offense report, his face calm as a man reading from a manual. "She has people," he said once, not accusing, not comforting. People she still trusts. People who owe her favors. I lived with the restraining order like a bandage. It kept things from happening physically, but not in the quieter ways that measure a life. Invitations rescinded, the absence at birthdays, the deletion of me from group threads. The order read like a promise in legalese and felt like the minimum. There were no guarantees against rumor or the slow drip of community memory eroding me. Then came the text. It arrived on a morning that had been otherwise ordinary: toast burned in the toaster, the cat having knocked over a plant, and read: "You took everything from me, enjoy the ruins." The unknown number, the hyphen spaced like a taunt. I stared at it until the pixels blurred and put the phone face down on the table. When I picked it up again I tried to parse it like a document: intent, sender, authentication. The sender was cleverly anonymous. The sentence was not. Tom called an hour later to say Sophie had been denied bail, that the audit's appendix had been submitted as evidence. Detective Harris left a voicemail asking me to hold tight, to let them do the work. My parents' number still went to voicemail with a message that said they would return calls soon. Rita's last text sat like an unsent letter. Vindication turned out to be a landscape with barbed wire. The court had given me paperwork, restitution agreements, a list of accounts frozen. The auditors had found bank entries that mapped almost exactly to the phone calls I'd saved and the emails I'd printed. The ledger was truth-speaking, incontrovertible. But truth does not smooth everything. It rearranged the furniture of my life so that I kept bumping into the edges. At night I lay awake thinking of the ledger and the auditor's stamps, and of Sophie in a cell typing the next layer of her defense. I thought of the anonymous number, the packages, the faces at work, my parents' refusal to look at me. I thought of the one column in the audit that had a faint, scrawled annotation in an old file photo, a handwritten name the auditor had not recognized and had set aside. I opened the appendix to look at that line again. It read like loose thread. It asked to be tugged.